So good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the NESMA 2017 seminar. My name is Mark Betcher, and on behalf of NESMA New South Wales, I'd like to thank you for giving up your time this morning. I'd like to welcome to our guest presenters today, Terry Miller from the Department of Planning and Environment, Scott Emerson from Controlling Power, and Rowan Peck from Mission Critical Systems. Since our last seminar at Lane Cove Test Facility, NESMA nationally have made some adjustments to the national website. We urge you to visit the site, which is constantly being updated with changes to membership details, links and uploads. It also contains contacts to all the state presidents. The address is www.nesma.org.au. Since our last the test station seminar, we've also expanded our membership. Now includes NESMA Tasmania, which is where we held our annual national conference last year. Actually, it was a very successful conference. This year's actually is in Adelaide. So NESMA nationally are doing quite well. We're expanding. The membership is gaining ground, and we're making a name for ourselves. We have 3 presentations today. And at the conclusion of each presentation, there will be time allocated for questions. So if you can hold off in your questions until the presentation is actually finished. We request that you please raise your hand, and one of us will find you and ask you to use a microphone. Our first presentation is titled "The Smart Meter Revolution and its Impact on Service Equipment Suppliers and Installers," and will be presented by Terry Miller from the Department of Planning and Environment. Terry's a Senior Technical Advisor, Electricity Networks in the Division of Resources and Energy, New South Wales Government. His responsibilities include the administration of the New South Wales Service and Installation Rules and the Industry Safety Steering Committee, as well as providing advice to Government on electricity network matters. Terry has over 50 years' experience in the electricity supply industry, including 20 years at executive management level, most recently at Essential Energy. So please welcome Terry Miller.
Thanks, Mark. Good morning, everyone. Yes, well, as you can tell, I have been around for a while. But I can tell you that none of those 50 years prepared me for the challenges I faced when I came on board to the department late last year to finish the implementation of the smart meter rollout, which was already in train. Quite an interesting and challenging project, which is still going. And what I want to talk to you this morning about is largely how that all came apart, the background, what brought about the smart meter revolution, some of the advantages of smart meters and why they're so important, and finally the impact on you as suppliers and installers and manufacturers and some of the challenges we face. I haven't got all the answers. I have got some questions. And I want to emphasise this morning how we all need to work together to make it all work properly. And there's still some things that need doing, but it is starting, I hope, to go pretty well. Okay, so that's the end game of smart meters, to have happy customers enjoying a lifestyle. The smart meter revolution is about providing customers better choices for their energy use. What I want to do is, just to work, which it does, talk to you about the background, about COAG, what COAG is and how it came up with what's called the power of choice, exactly what a smart meter is, for those of you who mightn't know, the rollout of smart meters in New South Wales, how that's happening. We're currently going through a sort of a changeover period that's ending on the 1st of December. And then some of the more technical and regulatory issues such as safety and protection, the service and installation rules of New South Wales, what they are, where they're heading, a few other headaches, and the way forward. So how and why did all this happen? Well, it wasn't just a whim of someone on a Saturday afternoon having a lunch at a barbecue that we'd have smart meters in New South Wales. It was a very long, considered process by a whole range of people, and it certainly wasn't thought through quickly. And just to give you some background on that, can you hear me up the back okay? Great, thank you. It starts at the top with this body called COAG, which is the Coalition of Australian Governments. Now, a lot of people think that's the federal government. It's not the federal government. It is all the states and the federal government acting together as a coalition. The reason they do that is that the Commonwealth government has no constitutional power largely to make legislation in important areas such as energy. So they have to coerce and persuade the states to do stuff that they want to happen, and they do that with a sort of a carrot and stick approach to, by way of grants and concessions and so on, to encourage the states to adopt legislation that they think is desirable. Now, if you think of all the states of New South Wales and the federal government agreeing on something, it's pretty good that they come out with anything at all, really, but they have come out with some very good initiatives over the past 15 years or so, including, of course, the competition in the revolution in the electricity supply industry, competition in wholesale and retail markets, the national regulation of the network businesses, which was once done by the states, and most recently, which we're talking about today, the so-called Power of Choice initiative. Now, I would mention that the way this is all enacted in legislation is that each state has to do its own legislation. The way this has been done is that one state, and has been quite often South Australia, passes model legislation which is then emulated by the other states. So you'll find each of the states in the national electricity market, for example, each have almost identical law. In New South Wales, it's called the National Electricity Law. I think something like that, National Electricity Act, New South Wales. And so in the electricity area, under the COAG Energy Council, which is one subset of COAG, we've had things like the Australian Energy Market Corporation, Australian Energy Market Operator and the Australian Energy Regulator. They're all creatures of COAG. So that's where it all started. Okay, so out of COAG the idea started in November 2012 was this so-called power of choice concept. Basically a whole range of initiatives to improve customers' choice. So we've come from, if you look at the electricity supply industry, from a totally monopoly industry, 20 years ago, where we had government-owned generators and combined network operators and retailers, to now, of course, a fully competitive market with regulated network operators. And the aim of the power of choice was to extend that competition and contestability and range of options to customers to more areas. Things like demand-side participation, customers being able to get access to details about their electricity consumption, to inform their choices about when they will use energy and how they will use it. A move, if you haven't been involved in electricity pricing for the past 20 years, you wouldn't be aware of the massive movement in pricing that has occurred towards so-called cost reflectivity, which means basically user pays. We came from an era 20 years ago where prices were heavily subsidised in certain areas, particularly to domestic consumers who were 20 years ago paying roughly half the price that commercial and industrial customers were paying. That has now all changed because of the introduction of competition and regulatory decisions under AER and COAG. So anyway, one of the little bits of the power of choice was the so-called competition in metering, which came out in November 2015. Now we're talking at this stage of the small end of the market because we already have had, as you know, competition in metering for larger consumers for some time, but the idea was to extend this to the small end of the market, which is what has happened. So we then come to what's happening in New South Wales. Now, when I said there's uniform legislation across all the states, that's not quite true. Each state has some wriggle room in how they enact each little bit. So there's general legislation covering broad areas, but each state decides on its own basis when and how it will adopt certain bits. So New South Wales had the decision of whether it would or not adopt and when it would adopt smart meters, and our minister foreshadowed that in November 2014 this was coming, and he waited until COAG adopted the Energy Council recommendation in November 2015 and got legislation through Parliament pretty quickly by 1 July when it all kicked off. And so that legislation removed the monopoly power of network operators to own and supply meters to small customers in New South Wales. It did a whole pile of other little things also, like removing the obligation to inspect installations. So network operators are no longer obliged to have installation inspectors, and you'll find they're largely withdrawing from that field. There are other related things like sealing of meters and so on, which have been removed to allow the new metering providers, installers, to install and seal their own meters. Okay, so why did this all happen? Retailers in particular have been unhappy for some time about network operators having a monopoly on meter ownership and provision. Retailers like to be able to distinguish their product and offer a variety of products to customers rather than just selling a commodity which is electrons. They want to sell diverse product, lifestyle options to customers, I suppose you could call them. And one way of doing that is to be able to supply a meter of their choice. The other thing that prompted this to happen was that you may recall the solar bonus scheme that was enacted about 5 years ago with a very generous subsidised price for solar export. When that happened, there was a sudden rush of people wanting meters that would record their solar generation, and we had 130,000 people in New South Wales wanting to do that, and something like 400 authorised ASPs, they're called, working for the network operators who could install them. And there wasn't also, at that time, a temporary shortage of suitable meters. That caused a whole lot of hassles at the time, and of course today, when December last year when that scheme ended, the reverse is now happening, where we've got 130,000 people who no longer want to have what's called a gross meter. They want to go back to a net meter, and we've got 130,000 metres that need changing quickly. So one of the things that prompted the change of the rollout of smart meters was the thought that we would have 35,000 electricians in New South Wales who could be eligible to install meters, rather than the limited number of ASPs working for DNSPs who could do that work. That hasn't quite happened as quickly as we thought, but that was one of the stimulants at the time for the decision. Okay, so what is a smart meter? It's really not a technical term. It's a term that's used in the area. It's also called an advanced meter. It's basically a type 4 meter aimed at the small consumer end of the market. So it's a digital meter, records time in data intervals. It has at least one-way communication, so it can be remotely read. Can have two-way communications, and I'll talk about the advantages of that in a minute. The communications is usually by a cell phone chip or card in the meter. That's becoming an issue when you've got a customer at the back of nowhere who doesn't have cell phone reception, but the meter installers are working on other options for that. And as I said, it can have two-way communications facilities, which I'll come to the advantages in a minute. So I'm getting mixed up with my buttons here. Okay, so some of the advantages of smart meters, and this is where it'll start to impact switchboard manufacturers, is that because they're remotely read, they no longer need to be in a place where the meter reader can see them. So all those requirements in the service installation rules, which are currently there, will go away because the meter can, in theory, be anywhere. We talk about under the kitchen sink, which is probably not a great place electrically or safely to, but it can go anywhere. There's a lot of gas meters under kitchen sinks, and they have created issues over the years, but they're not remotely read. A remotely read meter can sit anywhere. So while a lot of them are going on switchboards, they won't need to be there any longer soon. And as someone said to me at a meeting the other day, the switchboard of the future could be that big in the customer's premises, because all it'll need to have in it is an isolation point, a service fuse or whatever, and a neutral link. So we're moving away from all those sorts of things. And the retailers were very keen to get away from the one-size-fits-all meters imposed on them by the network operators. It's a bit like Henry Ford saying you can have any colour car you like as long as it's black. There was no variation enabled, which is understandable from the network operator's viewpoint. They didn't want to have to stock 100 different types of meters. They wanted one standard meter they could install, and up till now everyone's been happy with that. The other thing that's happening, of course, is that this whole technology is evolving really rapidly, and prices have plummeted. So we were heading down this track anyway. Sooner or later, even with network operators, I think that smart meters were going to be the way forward. But anyway, the retailers have got in first. And so it enables retailers to, as I said before, distinguish their offers from other and provide innovative products. There's tens of millions of these meters installed worldwide, so they're an established technology that appears to be working well. So some of the functionality that you can understand why retailers like these. Of course, the remote reading, of course, immediately saves money. The charges they currently pay the network operators to read the meter will disappear. There's also a remote disconnect and reconnect function, so you haven't got to go out to someone's premises to disconnect or reconnect them anymore. They'll just be done in a control room somewhere, organised by the retailer. There's a few safety issues with that which we're still working through. There's the old story about the power goes off and someone leaves a tea towel on the stove, and when the power comes back on, the house burns down, which apparently has happened. So we have to work through a few decisions on how we will enact that. That's still on hold, but we're working on a code of practice with the industry on what they will do before they reconnect someone remotely. Two-way communications, for example, will allow the retailer to talk to the customer, send them information about new products, price variations, supply interruptions, whatever, on their in-home displays. And the future concept of the home energy network, where the meter will interact with appliances in the home and switch them on, switch them off, do all sorts of fancy things like that. There's the solar, of course, managing the solar and battery export to the grid. And what's really exciting is that there's at least one or two organisations now talking about aggregating a lot of little customers' solar or battery export into one big generator that'll be a participant in the national market, and they can do that because they've got control over each customer's installation. So that's quite a big area, especially with a number of little batteries, because as you may be aware, storage is now becoming a big deal on the wholesale supply market, because we're heading towards a capacity shortage, and renewables are becoming a larger and larger part of the supply mix. And of course, renewables are great when the sun's shining and the wind's blowing, but when they're not, you need storage to back up the network. So storage is becoming a big deal. The other thing these meters can do is monitor power supply quality and reliability. So you've actually got a micro SCADA system across your network where you can get this data that tells you whether customers got supply or not, what their voltage is, what their power factor is, and so on. So that's a very powerful tool that I'm sure will be used by the network operators when they can sort out a deal with the retailer about how much information will cost them. And so on and so forth. So there's a whole pile of areas there that these meters will improve things for us. Okay, so let's now come to the nitty-gritty. And I better move along because I'm going slower than I thought I would. The New South Wales rollout officially started in July last year. It didn't sort of crank up until later in the year. We've got a changeover period ending 1 December this year. Up until then, you have an option of having a smart meter installed and owned by a retailer, or a traditional type 5 or 6 metre installed and owned by an ASP on behalf of the DNSP. That will end on the 1st of December, and all new meters after that date, including changes, will be smart meters. Now the big thing for most of you here is that this means that the meter is no longer part of the network operator's assets, and it becomes part of the consumer's electrical installation. So we then come into the issues about the service installation rules moving out of this area and other things taking their place. And I'll come to that in a minute. So we will see the older meters, existing meters, type 5 and 6, remaining for an indefinite period of time. I was told yesterday that at least some retailers are preparing a fairly aggressive rollout of smart meters after 1 December, and it may happen much more quickly than what I thought it would. But we'll see what happens. Okay, so let's come to the service installation rules. So the new legislation introducing smart meters required substantial changes to the New South Wales rules. The main one, which has affected switchboard manufacturers particularly, is that we now require an isolation device called an MPD, meter protection device, on each meter. Two reasons for that. One is that the meters need protection. We found it was in fact, existing type 5 and 6 meters can be unprotected on a switchboard without an individual device, so we've corrected that. But also there's an issue with safety. At the moment, there's a general ban, as you would probably know, on working live in New South Wales for electricians in general. The staff and authorised service providers of network operators have an exemption from that prohibition and can work live, so they can change a meter alive, whereas an electrician who will be doing this work from now on cannot. So we need the isolation device there so that the meter can be changed by just isolating it. This device needs to be an 80 amp fuse or equivalent for the protection reasons of the meter requested by the metering providers. There's still a 100 amp meter, but the characteristics of a 100 amp fuse are not enough to protect it apparently, so we've stipulated an 80 amp fuse. It doesn't have much change in a normal, single residence where the service fuse can in fact fulfil the same purpose. So you only need one device, but it's got to be 80 amps. It does impact multiple installations, such as blocks of units and so on. Now, the important thing is that because metering is no longer the domain of the network operators, Section 4 of the service installation rules will largely disappear after 1 December this year and leave a bit of a hole, which I'll come to in a minute. Okay, so some of the transitional issues that we've had was that we discovered it's pretty hard to get 80 amp fuses because we've used 100 amp fuses for so long, especially 80 amp fuses that will fit in the 100 amp base, which is the requirement of the new rules. That's gradually being overcome, but we had to allow an exemption for a while for people to use 100 amp fuses until reasonable supplies of 80 amp fuses became available. And of course, you've now got to provide a room on the switchboards for an isolation device alongside each meter. Now, when this all kicked off late last year, I had a number of switchboard manufacturers ring me saying, help, I've just built or designed or approved or manufacturing a switchboard for a new 200 block of units, and there's no room for the MPDs on the switchboard. We allowed a reasonable change over. We didn't want to say go and remake the switchboard if you already installed it or already made it. So we gave quite a few exemptions during that period to manufacturers to let them go through without the room for the fuses on the switchboard. That exemption period is now over, and you'll need to be dealing with that. If there's not enough room for the MPD on the existing switchboard, that'll now become the problem of the meter provider when they come to install the meter, and they'll need to do something, probably put the meter somewhere else. We've also had problems with a meter provider sends out an electrician, one of their authorised electricians, to install a new meter. They find they've got a defective switchboard, they've got an old asbestos switchboard. They can't isolate the supply and work dead. Well, they don't want to because the service fuses are on the barge board, or there's some difficult way of isolating supply. You go to a multi-tenanted site and there's no easy way to turn the supply off just to one customer. You've got to isolate large portions of the installation and so on. So they're all issues that the metering providers have been working through with us. And so, what happened then? There we go. So, just to reiterate, smart meters are now installed by a qualified electrician employed by an authorised metering provider. So the former qualification of an ASP, accredited service provider, level 2, working on behalf of a network operator, will no longer be needed after 1 December this year. What we are telling those ASPs though is you can go and get yourself authorised to work for the authorised metering providers and carry on as you did before. We're still working through that particular issue. So just to reiterate, network operators are no longer involved in metering. Smart meters installers cannot work live on the customer's switchboard. That's Safe Work New South Wales are very much involved in that. There apparently have been, despite all the efforts, delays in changing over these 130,000 customers with solar panels. That's starting to happen. We need more coordination between all the parties, retailers, metering providers, electricians and equipment manufacturers, to make sure this moves smoothly into the future, because there are a few little logistical issues that need sorting out. But I'll reiterate that the metering section of the service installation rules will largely disappear from 1 December because it'll be irrelevant. The DNSPs will no longer able or willing to get involved in metering issues, which becomes part of the customer's installation. The Office of Fair Trading will become involved because it's part of the customs installation. I think it's fair to say that they're largely interested in safety rather than how and what you build. So we'll need to start thinking about how we replace what's in the service installation rules with something else. Okay, so almost finished. The way forward. I think it's fair to say overall that governments are retreating from all sorts of areas. You've heard the story about, we want less red tape. We want fewer prescriptive rules from the government. That's what's starting to happen, and this is one example of that. Certainly, we're very anxious and willing to help everyone through that transition, but in the longer term, you're going to really have to rely less and less on government because we'll just gradually retreat from this area. And so there's a need, and I've spoken to a few people about this the last week or so, a need to establish your own standards about, find out from metering providers what they will need in switchboards of the future. I think probably you can use the current service installation rules provisions as a temporary basis, even though they'll have no enforceability, but they're better than nothing in the short term. So that's the challenge in front of us between now and December. Okay, thank you. Happy to answer any questions in the short time left available, which is about 30 seconds. Sorry, thank you. Thank you. Yes, sir. At the back there, yeah.
Yeah, you said that you could install the meter under the kitchen sink, right? But what about installing not the meter protection fuse, the service fuse and service equipment? Is that still going to be in Section 4 of the New South Wales Service Installation Rules, or does that all go as well?
No, the service installation rules will remain, other than the section on metering. So you'll still need to have a point of isolation of supply, normally the service fuse, and the neutral link in the same position as ever, somewhere accessible for emergencies and so on. The metering provision, on the other hand, the DNSPs don't want to know about that. So the meter can be anywhere. The isolation for the meter, I think the current rules say the isolation must be adjacent to the meter. So I think you're going to have to end up having, if you put the meter somewhere else, you're going to have something at the switchboard, then something adjacent to the meter. We've got to sort that out.
Just another quick one, sorry. You also said the switchboard can be anywhere. AS3000 actually says there's locations of switchboards, so it has to be an accessible area and somewhere where emergency services can be
correct, yeah.
accessible. So you can't just say
No.
the switchboard can be located anywhere.
No.
Because that's not right.
Sorry, I may have misled. The meter can be anywhere, okay? Not the switchboard. The switchboard still has to comply with all those requirements, but it won't necessarily have the meter in it. That can be somewhere else, okay?
So just clarifying what you said about this isolation device as MPD.
Yep.
Let's assume that the arrangement sticks how it is. You've got your service fuse next to the meter.
Yep.
That service fuse can act as the MPD.
Yes. In a single metered, like a single residence with one
and what happens to tagging that? Does the tag does the seal on that disappear because the meter is now tagged?
The meter will carry the metering provider seal.
The meter will, but will there be any seal on the service?
Yes, there'll still be seals on the service fuses for theft and so on.
So who can remove that if the metering is now done by the electrician?
Well, that's what we've got to sort out. That's what the legislation tried to fix, saying that the metering provider is going to have to be allowed to remove the seal. The whole legislation about sealing has been removed from the legislation and now becomes part of the supply contract. Okay, so what you'll find is that the metering provider will have to be able to remove and replace the seal on the, much the same way at the moment as electrical contractor can remove a seal and then notify the supply authority that he's done it, and they come back and replace it. Okay?
Thanks.
Sorry, one quick one. So we keep referring back to the authorised metering providers. We
Yep.
still, the way I understand it, there's the main problem with this is in a multi-tenancy, apartment building like you described, you can actually have multiple metering providers for the
Yep.
one installation,
Yep.
depending on the customers. So
Yep.
then, because apparently now already, whether everyone's picked up on it or not, according to your service rules, the latest release, instead of actually submitting your designs for the boards to the supply authority for review, it actually says to submit them to the meter provider.
Correct. Yep.
At which point do we actually get informed who the meter provider is?
Yep. Yeah, that's precisely the issue.
Yeah,
Because-
and then you could have, in one block of
Yep.
apartments, you could have 10, 20
Yep.
different meter providers, and who gets the final judgment say?
That's the issue we have to resolve because, as you say, you're building a place a long time before someone decides who the retailer is going to be.
But
So-
not only that, you're going to have multiple meter providers. Who is it the one with the biggest stick that's going to get the final say in how the metering is going to be coordinated for that building?
Yeah. No, you've got the potential of having several metering providers installing their meters in the same premises. That's the choice of customers through
Will
their
the
retailer.
supply authority still dictate then the actual point of connection and your service protection settings and those sorts of
Yes.
things?
So the supply authority's boundary, if you like, becomes the point of connection at the service fuse or whatever it is. Okay. Beyond there is the customer's installation, including the meters. Okay.
Yep.
So you're absolutely correct. That's one of the issues we all need to try and work through. We obviously need some sort of standard to say, by agreement of the metering providers, this is what they need as a minimum to put their meters in. You can't, you don't want 10 different requirements, obviously. Having said that, don't forget that the option of not having the meter on the meter board takes a lot away because they could just put a connector there and put it somewhere else. So you may find that in a block of units, the meters will be in the units rather than down in the. You don't need to have them in a common metering room anymore because there's no meter reader to turn up and read them. Sorry, yeah.
Sorry. Physically, you probably wouldn't do that, but if it's, if you're all looking at 100 or 80 amp tenancies, by the time you're running your submains all the way from your main point up to each metering and, separate apartments and all those sorts of things, it's probably going to be more cumbersome than the, current.
Well, it's currently done in, say, high-rise office blocks, for example. So it's not. I mean, you're right. I mean, there are issues, but it's not impossible. That's exactly what we need to try and resolve.
There was one other thing there you mentioned about how they're going to be getting like all small participants, for instance, in your solar and battery storage,
Yeah.
putting them together and putting them back
Yeah.
as one provider as an embedded generation point. So where does that then change with your regulations for embedded generation over 30 kilowatts and
it's all-
secondary
yeah.
protection?
It's all got to be. They've got to get the approval for that. It's just a concept at this stage. They're talking about having, 1,000 customers. They add them all together and bid into the wholesale market.
Yep.
The concept of embedded generation is more about the impact on the local network rather than the wholesale market operation.
Yes.
So you can become a participant in the wholesale market without getting worried about those, embedded generation rules, which, as I say, are about how you can connect to the network and what impact it will have on the local network.
Yep.
Okay.
What happens with existing multiple dwelling installations where the existing switchboard might be too small to fit the additional service fuses? Currently you can have several meters on one fuse, and in most of the multi-dwelling installations they're three-phase supply, so you've got 3 service fuses, so you can have a number of meters. What if the space is tight and the new switchboard will not allow for additional service fuses to be fitted? And will there be additional space required for the new smart meters? Or will they fit in the existing standard type 5 and 6 metres space.
It becomes an issue on existing switchboards, that becomes an issue for the metering providers. They'll obviously want to have meters that are small enough, not buy big ones. That's up to them. An issue they have to resolve. One solution, as I just mentioned, is they don't have to put the meter on that switchboard. They may wire it off and put
That's
it somewhere
assuming that involves costs to the customer.
that's
I
right,
presume it's an
absolutely, yeah.
existing installation, which the customer
yeah.
may or may not be willing to
No,
pay.
that's absolutely correct. The cost of all this ultimately ends up with the customer. Most retailers are rolling those prices up in their retail offer, so it gets buried. But certainly, it's the cost goes on the customer.
In addition, in similar multi-dwelling installations, you have the service fuses are on the existing switchboard near the meters.
Yep.
In some instances, you might have consumers' mains, which are non-fire rated, running through ceiling spaces to get to and down cavities to get to those service fuses.
Yes.
The only way to isolate and make the installation safe for a firefighter will be to disconnect the consumer's mains at the point of attachment, which might be at the facade of the building.
Yep.
Is there any thought been given to putting in safety or isolation devices at the point of attachment or fire rating the consumer's mains?
Well, my current understanding is that the consumers' mains do need to be fire rated now, or they need to be protected. But that you're getting into the AS3.
Protected normally by the distributors, 400
Yeah.
amp
Yeah.
fuses
Yeah.
and substations.
There is no general move to do what you just said. That's getting back to the old sort of bargeboard fuses idea, which had its issues. That's more an AS3000 issue now, which is a bit beyond my area, unfortunately.
Yeah, so Hugh Fraser. Now, smart meters, they can be installed by a licensed electrician here at the front.
Oh, sorry.
That's all right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so smart meters can be installed by just a licensed electrician.
Yes.
Who are the suppliers of these, who are the authorised metering providers?
Okay, so you only need, a qualified electrician who's engaged and authorised by the metering providers.
Yeah, so who are the
Metering providers are bodies, there's several of them around, who are registered with AEMO in the market, so they're registered. There's a whole pile of legislation in the national framework for metering providers to be registered and approved. And so you've got, in some cases, metering providers who then authorise metering installers, but it's all a regulatory requirement of the national market.
So on a multi-storey building,
Yep,
we could have 5 different
could.
metering providers.
you could, yeah.
So how does the switchboard company note who to send the drawings to for approval?
It's exactly what we need to resolve, yes. Exactly. Which is why we need a common standard or something to replace what's currently in the service installation rules.
So will the board builders be given a list of these authorised metering providers?
Yeah, they're out there now,
Okay.
yeah. Now, they're still, I mean, it's all new for them too, don't forget. And they formed, or forming an industry association which will help work through these issues. But it's something that does need to be thought through, yes.
The metering reseller doesn't have anything to do with the meter.
Sorry?
The metering, the energy resellers do not have anything to do with.
Well, they've got a business relationship. They're separate bodies, though. So each retail will have their preferred metering provider. Yeah. Sorry, we're going over time here. I didn't mean to do that.
Yeah, if the smart meter belongs to the client, can he connect the data connection between that and the house energy safety measures?
Sorry, say again. I quite missed that.
So if the smart meter becomes the client item,
Yeah.
are we allowed to connect the solar panel or generator or anything in through the control system to that meter?
Well, the smart meter becomes part of the consumer's installation. Although you've paid for it, it's probably still the responsibility of the metering provider, and you can't. You've got to have if you want to connect a solar generator or whatever to it, you've got to have the right meter. So you just can't hook up a solar panel or a battery, say, without checking that the meter is the right one to do that job.
Isn't this smart meter take care of the modern technology?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, a smart meter is a range of products.
All right, it's not
Okay.
a single meter, it's a,
Yeah, there's a range of products for different purposes, so it may or may not fulfil what you need. You'll need to check that with the...
okay, assuming that the new meter is compatible with the solar system,
Yeah.
export, import, all the readings, will they allow, say, do you need to get permission from somebody to plug in your
Well, you still need to...
RJ45
the requirements for additions to an installation under the service installation rules still apply, so you've got to...
go through?
comply with all that and put in the notifications and so on. None of that's changed. Okay?
Right.
The assessment of what metering you will require becomes an issue for your retailer and metering provider rather than the DNSP. I think that's the best way to explain it.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Okay?
Thanks, Terry.
So,